This is the podcast for week 3. We're on chapters 4 and 5 on political participation and political parties. So let's get started with the questions. The first question is why people don't participate. And there's a lot of reasons. I would say probably the most important reason is that they simply don't care enough about politics. I know I didn't write that down here, but that's really what it is. The other things are the kinds of things you read in books about why people don't participate. Um, and so let's talk about some of those. The first one I listed here is leisure time and energy. It's important to know that people who have um, flexible work hours, they work in jobs where they can take time off if they need it, if they're, or they have jobs where they don't have to work full schedules. And that would be almost everybody who's not in a blue collar job where they have they have the ability to take some work home, ability to um, work other hours other than 9 to 5, that kind of thing, to make up for time that they might want to take off. So you see people in white collar jobs, especially professional people, lawyers, doctors, teachers, who can do that kind of thing. And of course, the more leisure time you have, the more energy you have, and therefore the more likely you are to think about politics and to participate in politics. People who don't have leisure time, and I know I grew up in that kind of environment. My family were blue collar workers. They weren't educated. My father only went to the 4th grade, and then he got a job to help his family out. And so he never went to school, and his reading ability was pretty limited, and all the rest. So, people who are in blue collar jobs, a lot of times like that, there's physical energy that's exerted on the job. And as a result, they just really come home exhausted. I know my father was like that. And so he would do a blue collar job. He was in a factory. And he'd come home and, he would eat dinner and then just sit down in front of the TV. So he didn't have a whole lot of time for reading, leisurely reading. I'm not sure that uneducated people do leisurely reading anyway. Even reading the newspaper was pretty limited, again, like I said, because of his education. And I think the biggest thing about that is not so much that the people in the lower classes tend not to have the abilities, or intellectual capacity to understand what they read or see on TV or whatever. It's not that. It's they tend to defer to other people. They think, I don't know as much as this educated person. I didn't go to college. And they have a kind of inferiority complex about that sort of thing. So anyway, those kinds of people are not going to participate in politics beyond the act of voting. They're just not going to do it. They don't have the self-esteem to do it. They think they don't have the intellectual capacity to do it. And oftentimes they don't have the leisure time or the energy because, that kind of stuff really is it kind of requires people to have a lot of both leisure time and energy. The second thing is alienation. People in this world in the 21st century, when it comes to politics, are pretty much alienated, and that includes almost all of us. A sense that we're not being represented, a sense that the elected officials are not people who are like me, that sort of thing. Um, so that's kind of where the average citizen is. They're essentially alienated from a lot of politics. I mean, if you walk around and you ask people, do you think politics is corrupt and that most public officials are on the take? You wouldn't have to live in Chicago to see that most people would kind of agree with that. Another one, a third one, is apathy. People today seem to be overly busy, and they really are busy. I'm not sure that they're doing productive things. People are on, when they're not watching television, they're on some other kind of device, usually their phone, and they're answering emails and Twittering and all that kind of stuff that goes on. And as a result, they tend to be removed from politics. It's the sense that it isn't anything that's really that important to me. That's the feeling. It isn't that important to me. And that's where the apathy comes in. Why should I bother with this? I've got my family, I've got my job, I've got my career if I'm in school, trying to work on developing a career, that kind of stuff. So that's the nature of politics in the 21st century, alienation and apathy. I think that's essentially how you got Donald Trump, a guy with no background whatsoever in politics, to become president of the United States. The only way people would vote for a presidential candidate with no background is if they're alienated and apathetic about what is really going on. They wouldn't, if they studied politics and they studied what was really how the system worked, they would know that Trump essentially didn't know what he's talking about when he was saying he was going to do one thing and another. I've mentioned this as well, and that's the distrust of politics and politicians. That goes hand in hand with alienation, apathy, and we could also add in their cynicism. So, it's just how people are. They just don't feel like the system's working for them. Another thing is that people generally don't like the candidates in any given election. This was especially the case in this last election, where you talk to people and they really didn't like Donald Trump, and I'm not sure anybody liked the Clintons. I think you have to put them together. Hillary was part of Bill Clinton's family, of course, being his wife, and she couldn't separate herself from his history, and then she had her own history, and so a lot of people didn't like him. They didn't trust him. It wasn't that they didn't think she was doing a good job when she was in the Obama administration or something like that. It was mostly that they didn't trust them as people. Again, that's how Bush got elected. Second Bush, W, how he got elected was people felt he wasn't. Almost everybody thought he wasn't very smart, but that didn't matter. People thought he was more trustworthy and more of a family person and genuinely a nice guy. They described him as somebody you would like to have a beer with. And I think to a great degree he is like that. But the point is that it's alienation, cynicism, apathy that brings you to that point where you don't say, I'm looking at the qualifications and the policy positions of the candidates. No, I'm just looking for somebody who might be a little bit more honest than the bastard who's in there now. That's the kind of thing we see, and we've seen that for a long, long time. Donald Trump is just the kind of the final version of this process that's been building up for so long, where people are alienated and cynical and not wanting to participate in politics. That's been going on since about, I think I first saw it being tracked in the polls in 1968. So it's been a long time. And then the last one is that the public sees social action, volunteering and that kind of stuff at the hospital or some private or other private organization, or marching in the march against breast cancer and that kind of stuff is more profitable or useful or beneficial than political activity. That should say political activity. Anyway, those are some of the reasons why people don't participate beyond the act of voting. The second question is, how do we increase the number of people at the polls? How do you get more people to go and vote? Well, there's a lot of things that have been recommended, most of which never get enacted. The reason we don't really change things much, we just keep having these elections on the Tuesday of the first month or the second week, depends on what level of election it is, in November or sometimes thereafter, but almost always having an election on a Tuesday, which isn't very practical for anybody. So why don't we do it? Why don't we change it? We don't change it because the people who have to change it are the elected officials, and they're kind of afraid to do that. They're afraid to increase the number of people that are voters and increase the potential for somebody who didn't vote in the last election, meaning probably didn't want to vote for them, to allow any kind of change like that would potentially disrupt the election and potentially throw the incumbents out. So they would, knowing that, they tend not to want to expand the electorate. Anybody who's in office now doesn't really want to expand the electorate, and that's what changing the rules would do. That's why, in some sense, you have to give a lot of credit to President Nixon, because he lowered the voting age to 18 when he was president. It was 21 before that to vote in a national election, and he changed it to 18. And he was told by most people who were supposedly in the know that if he did that, it would mean that there would be more votes for the Democrats, and that certainly the 18-year-old vote was not going to go to him. But he did it anyway. You have to kind of give him credit for that. I mean, I was certainly not a Nixon fan, just like I wasn't a Reagan fan. But you have to give him credit for that. So anyway, here's some of the things that are proposed. And you see them at the state level sometimes when they talk about states being a experimental laboratory that is an opportunity to try new things. This is one of the areas where you see the states doing, or some states doing these things. The first one is weekend voting. So rather than have it on a particular day during the week, you'd have weekend voting. They do that primarily in Europe, where the countries are smaller and you have to go back to your original place of registration in order to vote. But that would help people because first of all, on the weekend people aren't working. Most people aren't working. And secondly, it gives you 2 days rather than just 1 day to vote. Another thing that keeps people from voting is registration laws. If you're not registered, you can't vote. And if you made that registration laws easier, that is, like, say, when people show up to vote, allow them to register at that time, then you could get more people to vote, because usually registration is cut off about a month or so before the election, and then people get interested in the last couple of weeks and they say, well, I'd like to vote, but I'm not registered and it's too late now. So changing the registration laws to liberalize them, actually liberalizing all the laws that exist about voting, would increase the numbers of people. Not dramatically, maybe about 5 or 10%, but that's a lot of people, and that's enough to change the outcome of most elections. Another thing is online voting. We do everything online. We bank, we buy things, we do all kinds of stuff, and it's argued that we could also vote that way. People who don't like online voting argue that it's too dangerous, it can be corrupted and all of that stuff. But I don't know. It just seems to me that it's not any worse than any of the other systems. Um, Another thing would be we should get better candidates. Every time you get an interesting candidate, you see that that increases the number of people who show up. Like, for example, in the last presidential election, you had Bernie Sanders, and he really generated a lot of interest among young voters. Even though he's an old man, he talked about the issues that face especially college students. And you could see that there were a lot of college students across the country um, interested in the Bernie Sanders campaign and working in this campaign and willing to vote for Bernie. So that's the kind of thing you had. Back in my time, it was Adlai Stevenson. I never saw a candidate who was able to generate more new people coming to the electorate interested in politics for the first time than the governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, when he ran for president. So you get that kind of, that's what they're talking about. Get better candidates, meaning get candidates that can generate an interest in people. Um, Probably to some degree, that's what Trump did. Another thing is change the party system. That is, right now we have just the Democrats and the Republicans. We don't allow really for third parties or independent candidates very much. You have to be a Democrat or Republican or run as a Democrat or Republican. Bernie wasn't a Democrat. He was a socialist when he ran and, for the Senate, and then in order to become part of the system, he joined. You independent candidate like him would join one of the parties that he's closest to, and in Bernie's case, it was the Democrats. So in effect, he becomes a Democrat because you have to be. It's a two-party system. You're either a Democrat or Republican, or you're a loser. So, that's kind of what happens. I'm not sure Donald Trump was really a Republican, but he joined up with them because he felt that his views were much closer to them than it was to the Democrats. And another thing would be if we would really start addressing the issues, the important issues we face in this country, medical reform, taxes, um, education, higher education, the tremendous cost of it, and so on. If we would address these kind of issues, or the constant need to be in a small war somewhere in the world, killing off many of our young people. So if we would start really addressing these issues in the campaigns, that might increase people coming to the polls. But what we see is personality campaigns, and it's at all levels, national, state, and local, where essentially what candidates do is they attack each other. Vote for me because I'm not as bad as the other people who are just awful. And you see that over and over again, whether it's a gubernatorial campaign or a presidential campaign or whatever it is, they're not addressing the issues. We have these long, drawn-out campaigns, and then when it's all over, we have no idea what the candidate who wins is going to do. So anyway, if we would change these kinds of things that are listed here, and it's argued that we would increase the numbers of voters by at least somewhere between 5 and 20%. Number 3, what's the role of political parties in the system? Well, political parties do a number of things. They simplify choice. You're given 2 candidates on the ballot, a Democrat and a Republican usually, and that's it. And that simplifies your choice as opposed to a whole bunch of people. Like, for example, in a primary, like if you go back to the presidential primaries, you had debates among the Republicans, and you had a whole list of candidates. There was about 10 that were running for the nomination, or, vying for the nomination to be the candidate. And so in a sense, the parties decide that, the primaries, the system of limiting one way or another. Could be convention, could be primaries, could be party bosses picking somebody. But essentially, each party, the Democrats and Republicans, wind up with one person. And that's what we mean by simplifying their choice. So instead of having 10 candidates on the ballot, you have 2. Parties unite the electorate. That is, they're kind of umbrella organizations. Parties are umbrellas. They have liberals, conservatives, and everything in between, calling themselves Democrats or Republicans. So you have, like, in the Republican Party, you have the Tea Party candidates, and you don't have too many liberals anymore. You used to have the New York liberals as part of the Republican Party, and I don't think you have that much anymore. But yeah, there's room in the parties for almost everybody, and so that's why they say they unite the electorate. Number 3 is they present issue positions. Supposedly, the Democrats and the Republicans, and I said this was a problem, present different issues. The Democrats tend to be pro-abortion, for example, and the Republicans tend to be against it. The Democrats tend to be for gun control, and the Republicans tend to be against it. So there's, a kind of broad issue areas that the Democrats tend to be in line with, and the Republicans on the opposite side of that issue. Not too many of those. Unfortunately, not enough of the big issues or important issues with meaningful positions. And then the last thing I've got here is they unified a government. The government is divided, as you know, with this studying federalism. The government is divided. Not only is it divided between the national, state, and local governments, power divided that way, but it's also divided within the government. So if you look at the national government, or you look at the state, you have the executive, the legislature, and the judicial, the three branches, and you can add in there the bureaucracy as well. So there's like 4 branches. And power is divided among those 4. So what the parties do is unite them. Like, for example, the Supreme Court, when we just had a nomination by President Trump, that unites the executive branch and the Supreme Court, because now the Republicans have the majority in the Supreme Court, and they can vote pretty much with the Republican Party, which is the same kind of position that you find in the legislature and in the executive. So you have that same kind of thing at the state level, not as much at the local level, but at the state level, definitely. There's the governor, and if the governor is of a certain party, and the legislature is of the same party, Democrat or Republican, that helps them pass legislation. Here in New Mexico, we've got a situation that's very similar to what you have in Illinois, where the governor is a Republican and the legislature is dominated by the Democrats. So as a result, the legislature will pass things, and then it goes to the governor, and the governor vetoes it. So this is the kind of thing that happens, and so you don't get working together. If the Democrats held both positions, the governor and the legislature, then probably those pieces of legislation that get passed in the legislature would not get vetoed. They'd get voted on by the governor. At least that would be the tendency for that to happen. And so when that would happen, you would call that the parties uniting the government. Okay, the last question is, why are the parties in decline? Well, in a sense, everything we talked about so far explains why the parties are in decline. The fact that they're not offering candidates the public likes, and they're not dealing with the issues, and so on. But here's another set of answers to that question, why are the parties in decline? For one thing, you've got the primaries, and the primaries weaken the parties because the party really doesn't choose the candidate running for governor or senator or president or whatever it is. It's decided in the primaries, and the primaries are open generally to almost anybody. As a result, the people who get chosen may or may not be the choice of the party regulars. I know at the presidential level, you still have an influence by the conventions, and the delegates to the conventions have something to say about who gets to be the presidential nomination. But the primaries weaken the parties because somebody can come along who's really not the kind of typical Republican or Democrat who would be chosen. That is somebody who's worked their way in the party and went through several different elected offices and proven themselves and worked for the party in many ways. All of those kind of things would be the kind of criteria that would be used by the party leaders to choose somebody to be governor, to be the gubernatorial candidate, I should say, or to be presidential candidate or whatever level it is. But the primary, you can have a person, obviously demonstrated by somebody like Barack Obama, and more so by Trump, who never really worked their way through the party, never really spend much time sort of paying their dues, if you will. In the case of Trump, he didn't spend any time doing that. He spent his time in the private sector. So they're not the typical kinds of people. Last two presidents are not the typical kind of people who would have been ever selected by party leaders. So the primaries, you don't have to be chosen by the party leaders. You're chosen virtually by the public. So that's one reason why they're weaker. TV is another thing that weakens it. In the old days, under the old system, you really had surrogate campaigning before television. You had surrogate campaigning. In other words, somebody went and knocked on doors, like a precinct captain or somebody in the party, telling you to vote for President Roosevelt or Hoover or whoever. And as a result, the public didn't have a direct connection between the candidate and themselves. They really didn't see the candidate. But television came along, and when television came along, that changed everything. Television changed everything about everything in the United States, but it particularly changed the way people view candidates, because now they know what they look like, and they know what they sound like, and they know what they say. So that's kind of what they do. They choose candidates as opposed to parties. Back in the old days, they used to, if you were a Democrat, you voted for the Democratic candidates, regardless of who they were. And the same thing if you're a Republican. But today, thanks to television, you see the people, and you get an image of that person, and therefore you vote the person, not the party, thanks to television. Another way of putting it is my third one: candidate image over party. In other words, people see the candidates on TV, and they focus on whether these people have a capacity to do the job. A focus on, is this candidate the one I really want to be governor, or I want to sit in the legislature? It's looking at those kinds of people and seeing what they do that decide for people, rather than say, well, I'm voting for this particular person because they're a Democrat, or I'm voting for this person because they're a Republican. I remember when I was a kid, I had studied the president in school. I don't remember what grade I was in, probably about the 4th or 5th grade. And we were studying the presidency, and we talked about President Eisenhower because he was the president then. And also, I became interested in them. I didn't know anything really about the political parties or anything. And I sat down. There was the conventions in those days when you watch television, when the conventions were going on in the summer, they showed the whole thing. I mean, it was on like starting maybe about noon or 1 o'clock, and it ran all the way to nighttime, maybe the end of the viewing evening by about 9 o'clock or something. So anyway, I sat down to watch the Republican convention because I knew Eisenhower. I didn't know anything about Stevenson, who was the Democratic candidate running against him. Eisenhower was a Republican. So I sat down to watch the Eisenhower campaign, or I should say the Republican convention. And my dad walked in the room and he said, "Turn that off." He said, "We're Democrats. We don't pay any attention to the Republicans." And, so there you go. He was a typical candidate running, a typical voter interested in the party rather than the candidate. But that changed. Essentially with television, that changed. Another thing is a change in fundraising. Interest groups do the fundraising now, not the parties. Back in the day, way before, when you had party machines and bosses like Mayor Daley in Chicago, the first Mayor Daley, more than the second Mayor Daley. But anyway, when you go back to the old man, if you were chosen by the party, by the Democratic Party, to be the candidate of the Democratic Party, you didn't have to worry about paying for campaigns or raising money or any of that stuff. You didn't have to worry about any of that. All of that was handled by the party. But now, every candidate is their own fundraiser. And where do they get the money? They get the money not from their party. They get the money essentially from interest groups. Every interest groups that's out there, everybody interested in influencing public policy and it's organized, is generally there with their bags of money ready to give them to the candidates. And the candidates these days, again, largely because of television, need a lot of money, millions of dollars, and it's interest groups that give them to them. The importance of interest groups, another thing, is the importance of interest groups over parties. The interest groups have replaced the parties in some of the functions that parties do, particularly fundraising. Keep that in mind. And kind of what we have nowadays is at the highest levels, particularly the executive running at the national, state, and local level, you have candidates without parties. What I mean by that is that when the candidates run, whether you're talking about presidential candidates or you're talking about gubernatorial candidates or mayoral candidates, they don't really talk about the fact that they're Democrats or Republicans. When President Kennedy ran for president, he was on debates with President Nixon, and they were the first two candidates ever debate on television. President Kennedy drew the first straw, and he was allowed to talk first. And he came out, and his first words on television in the debate were, "You should vote for me because I'm a Democrat." Now, no candidate in the 21st century would ever say that. You should vote for me because I'm a Democrat or because I'm a Republican. They would say, vote for me because I'm qualified, I'm the best candidate, I'm educated, the whole 9 yards that we hear candidates talking about. So it's a different world that we live in, and as a result, the parties are in decline.